Hi, we are ready to get started. My name is Ben Sharda. I'm the Executive Director here at Kansas City Community Gardens. Welcome to our workshop about growing herbs. Um, we actually haven't done a workshop on growing herbs in a long time. We've been hearing lots of requests for it. We're actually going to try and recording this, so this will be online at some point, but we're not actually streaming it live. So we'll be able to do that. And also, if you want to get like a copy of the PowerPoint, I'm a note taker, and lots of times I'll go and I'll just try to write down everything the person is saying. But there will be, if you email us, we can actually send you the PowerPoint or at least a PDF of it. So if you want to see what's written on there, you don't have to write down everything. Here's kind of our outline for what we're going to talk about tonight. A little bit of background about herbs in general, and then we'll talk specifically about how to grow them, harvest them, and store them. And then the last part, we'll be talking about individual herb plants, the ones that are most popular. We're going to talk about culinary herbs when we get to that part. There are so many different kinds of herbs, it can be really overwhelming. All right, a little bit of definitions on herbs, because you hear about herbs and spices. Um, so is something an herb or is it a spice? And typically, the lines aren't always really clear, but basically, if something comes from a leaf or the flower and you're using that for a product, that would be the herb. But if something's from another part of the plant, like think of seeds or roots, like for instance, ginger is a root type thing and it's dried and ground, that's a spice as opposed to an herb. Sure, you use it in food. Cinnamon is actually the bark of a tree that's been dried and ground. That's a little bit different. Things like fennel seeds or coriander seeds. Turmeric is also a root. Chili comes from chili peppers. Well, those are not leaves. We think of those as spices. But when you go to the store, you'll see lots of the dried herbs. They're all herbs and spices are together, and you get your little spice rack, and you've got dried mint, you've got basil dried, you've got dried thyme, and they're in with the spices. So it gets confusing. But we're going to be talking about things that are usually like leaves or flowers that are used in different ways. So the other thing you'll hear about sometimes people talking about herbaceous plants, and that's more of a botanical term. Because there's usually in our plant world, we talk about woody plants and we talk about herbaceous plants. So herbaceous ones are the ones that don't produce wood, like a tree has annual layers of wood that add each year, or a shrub does that also. But ones that are softer and they actually don't make what is called wood, which is lignin, the material that plants make for wood. Um, so things like basil and oregano and lavender, they don't have woody stems. Now sometimes we'll run into some things that are kind of shrub-like, or they call it a subshrub, semi-shrub, like rosemary actually turns into a shrub. So we include that in with the herbs because it's not like a tree. So the lines aren't always real clear, but generally herbaceous plants, not all of them are useful as herbs. But so like technically a marigold is a herbaceous plant just because it doesn't make wood. But for tonight, we're talking about the useful plants. So think of plants that are used for different purposes. And it's kind of a useful definition for herbs. There's different life cycles, just like with flowers and vegetables. There's annuals, there's biennials, and perennials. So just a little review. Annuals, they go through their life cycle in 1 year, one calendar year. So basically, like you take a seed, it sprouts, it grows a stem, and then eventually it flowers, and then it sets seed, and then it dies all in 1 year. So that would be an annual plant. And these are just some example of annual herbs that would grow in that life cycle. That's not all of them. And then there's biennials, so they're a little bit different. And it goes through 2 calendar years. And typically what happens the first year, same thing, it sprouts the seeds, grows stems and leaves, but it doesn't flower that first year. Because typically with a biennial, it needs like a cold period to trigger that flowering response. So like parsley. and then it goes dormant over the winter, and then it comes up again the next spring, and then it flowers, and then it sets its seeds, and then it usually dies. So just there's not as many biennial herbs, but a couple that are most common would be parsley and caraway. So lots of times people are disappointed with their parsley because it went over the winter and it comes up, and then right away it almost goes to flower, and then it goes to seed, and it's not making very much leaves. So that's the way that works sometimes. So sometimes it's better just to replant your parsley every year. Or better, well, let's just do it this way. And then perennials, those are the ones that plants that live multiple years. Now the thing is, some varieties are winter hardy and some aren't. So he'll the term hardy perennials or half hardy perennial or um, tender perennial. But a hardy perennial has roots that will survive the winter, and they'll they'll go dormant, and then the next year they'll come up and sprout again and start growing again. Non-hardy perennials would be plants that would die when winter comes, and they're typically treated as an annual, which means that you have to plant them every year. The example of that would be like lemon verbena is one. It's just a tropical plant. So, or lemongrass. So when it gets cold, they just die. But if they were in the tropics, someplace was warm, it would just keep growing and growing and growing. It wouldn't die in 1 year. Rosemary too is not really a hardy perennial, but it is a perennial. So some people will bring their rosemary plant inside. But these are some hardy perennials. There's many more than this. These are just a few common ones: sage and thyme and chives and oregano. So when you plant those, they will grow this year, and then they'll go dormant, and then they'll come up again the next year. So you don't have to replant them. And that's obviously something that people like when you don't have to replant every year. All right, let's talk a little bit about categories of herbs. Obviously, there's culinary herbs, the ones that you cook with for adding flavor and seasoning to food, but there's also other kinds, and we'll talk a little bit about some of these. But today we're definitely going to focus more on the culinary herbs. But I want you to be aware, because as you're reading about herbs, you're just going to hear about lots and lots of different kinds of things, and you just want to be aware of different kinds of categories of herbs. So medicinal, then there's cosmetics. We'll use herbs in different cosmetics. Fragrances, I mean, perfumes like lavender have been around for years, but also there's a lot of aromatic oils used in aromatherapy. A lot of body care products. I mean, herbal use in body care products has exploded over the last 20 years. I just happened to be preparing for this class, and I'm looking at my shampoo this morning, and it's got like 10 different kinds of herbs in it, And I don't know if it really makes my hair better, but it sure sounds good, right? It's got rosemary and lavender and all kinds of stuff. But also deodorants and toothpaste and lotions. Many of them have herbs in them. And they smell good, but also they do have some beneficial things. And then, of course, there's tea. Familiar with herbal tea. So lots of different kinds of teas, especially if you're trying to avoid caffeine. Herbal teas are a good way to go. And there's even some insect repellents are herbal based, and so that could be useful. So just think of herbs as useful plants with many different kinds of uses, and not just culinary. But we are going to focus on the culinary ones today. All right, medicinal herbs. If you start reading either herb book or reading on the internet, there's long history, thousands of years of using herbs as medicine. But there's definitely some things to think about. So I tell people to beware folklore, beware just internet rumors, internet folklore, anecdotal information, like you heard from your Aunt Bessie that, she always used this herb, to cure, warts or whatever, or if you have a cold, she always made a tea and drank it out of this, and it made her all better. You have to be really, really careful, because if you'll read like about some plant like, I don't know, rosemary, it'll tell you like it's good for skin problems, it's good for stomach aches, it's good for diarrhea, it's good for headaches, all different kinds of things that they say herbs are good for. Just because somebody writes that doesn't mean that it actually works that way. It might mean that somebody tried it and it worked for them, but maybe their headache would have gotten better anyhow. Who knows? So look for research-based information if you're thinking about using herbs medicinally, either from university sources, government sources, because some herbs can actually be dangerous. Not so much the ones we're talking about tonight because they're culinary herbs, but there's lots of different plants in the world, and some of them are fully tested on human beings, or I don't know. You think about people growing plants over the years, and there are poisonous plants out there. So that means somebody tried eating that plant or using it as an herb at some point, and they found out this was not good. And so now that's a poisonous plant. But there are also potential for herb and drug interactions. Let's say you're taking some medication. There might be some herbs that maybe you should not be using. So anyhow, usually they say if you're taking some medications but you're using some herbal supplements, you should let your doctor know what you're taking so they can kind of let you know. And 99 out of 100 times they'll say, "Oh, that's fine what you're doing. It's okay. You're not going to cause problems here." But it's just good to know that. There are a couple of resources to be aware of. Actually, it's one main one. So the National Institutes of Health, which is part of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, has this website called Herbs at a Glance. Sometimes I'll say herbs because, like, if you're in England or France, they say herbs. Europe, and here we say herbs. But this herbs at a glance, you can go and look up and look up different herbs, and it'll tell you if there's actually some real medicine that's scientific based behind it. And some of them there are. Others, not so much. And it'll tell you, well, we've tested it for this. There've been lots of studies, but there's just not enough evidence to show that it really has some effect here. So if you're, buying stuff, herbal products, and you're thinking about using it because, oh, I've got a problem with my scalp or something, or, I'm having indigestion issues, so will chamomile tea help me? You can read about it and see if it actually has some real effect there. And in fact, there's even a app you can get for your phone, same place, called the Herb List app. And you can just go and download it like you would an app. And so like if you're at the store or if you're out in the garden somewhere and you want to read about something, you can check on that and find out if something actually has some medicinal effect. And so herbs also used in cosmetics, fragrances, body care products. These are some of the popular ones: lavender, peppermint, rosemary, chamomile, basil, aloe vera, thyme, sage, yarrow. But there's many others. And generally, these are all pretty much recognized as safe, or they wouldn't be using them in things that you're going to put on your skin, on your scalp, in your toothpaste, whatever. So they're all pretty safe. And like I say, they make things smell really good and are great. Aromatherapy. There's many herbs that are used in aromatherapy, and there's lots of claims made, that they can have, help improve your psychological condition or physical conditions. And most of what I read about is that there's not a lot of strong evidence. It's mostly anecdotal. Like, if you use certain aromatherapies, it may help you feel more calm. And that's great, or may help you feel more peaceful. Different things. And so some of them are straight up typical herbs that you might hear about. And basically they're essential oils. The ones that are generally from herbs are pretty much recognized as safe. But there's some other ones that are made from some other unusual plants you'll see sometimes, and some of those are a little bit more questionable. So before you use anything like that, I would just read about it and study it and make sure that's something that you want to do. This is all kind of safe stuff because they're things that you'd be smelling, normally. So insect repellents. Again, if you go on the internet, you will see all kinds of recipes. Like you can take garlic and ginger and mix it together with peppermint, and then you put it in the blender and smear it on yourself. You can, repel insects, and that may work. But here's a couple of them that actually have shown some scientific tests, research studies have been done. One is citronella oil. You'll hear a lot about citronella, and people get citronella candles and things like that. So that actually comes from lemongrass, which is an annual herb, tropical. It's used a lot in cooking and has a real strong lemon scent to it. And that actually, they make some insect repellents out of that, citronella. And then also there's a plant called lemon eucalyptus. And it actually grows into a tree and it's really tall, but you can grow it as an herb in your garden. And the leaves smell like lemon and they smell like eucalyptus, like cough drops. So it literally smells like a cough drop. But they've done scientific studies on that as far as repelling mosquitoes, and it is just as effective as those really strong chemicals that are made out of DEET, which is, in my mind, a questionable insect repellent because they've done a lot of studies that show it's not good for kids to be using. So I'm just not a big fan of those chemicals that you put on. But this is, sure, you're going to smell like lemon eucalyptus. It's great. You can buy that at stores like Walmart and Target. It did say that people who use the citronella candles, it has no effect whatsoever about keeping mosquitoes away because it's just not putting out enough scent. So you're much better off getting the repellent and putting it on your body and actually repelling the insects that way, as opposed to just lighting the candle or the little torch things or whatever. So, and also you'll hear a lot about herbs as companion plants. And again, you'll see all kinds of things on the internet. Like if you plant, garlic next to your tomatoes, you won't have certain problems with bugs. Or one of the ones I've seen a lot is if you plant certain plants next to your squash plants, you won't have problems with squash bugs or squash vine borers. And believe me, if there was some truth to that, I would be using that plant. I'm not against the idea. But most of it is just people plant some plant next to it and then they don't have a problem with that bug. But who's to say they wouldn't have had that problem anyhow? So you really have to actually do research. And from what I've read, there's not a lot of research that supports the use of companion plants. Sure, herbs are beautiful. You can mix them in with your vegetables, and that's fine. The only one that I actually know that actually works is there is an insect that attacks peach trees called the peach tree borer, and it bores into the trunk of the tree. And Matt Bunch, who is our horticulturist with our Giving Grove fruit tree program, has done a lot of research and has seen some actual research done by universities where if you plant chives, because they have that strong onion scent around the base of a peach tree, it will deter those borers from coming and boring into the trunk of the tree. And so that's something that I feel safe that's going to work. And it certainly won't hurt anything to plant those around the base of the peach tree. So they do that at lots of the orchards. They'll plant those chives around the orchard, and the smell of the onions from the chives confuses the borers because a lot of flying insects are attracted by scents, and so they come there. So that works because they plant it right around the trunk of the tree. Would that work with other things? I don't know the answer to that. We're trying, but that's the only one that I know that actually has some kind of scientific basis to it. So I just don't want to discourage people from, trying stuff, but just be aware that there may not be a lot of evidence to actually support if something actually works. You can also grow herbs for tea. Lots of like spearmint and peppermint tea. Chamomile tea is famous. Lemon balm used in tea, basil, lavender. Sometimes there'll be like teas that are like two different plants mixed together, two different types of herbs or a blend of herbs, and people make tea out of that. So sometimes it'll be just like one type of herb, like the peppermint herb. But basically all those are is herbs that have been dried and then crushed into a powder, and then they put them in a little tea bag. But you can certainly do that yourself at home and make your own teas and try different combinations and be really creative. The other benefit that herbs have that's not talked about a lot is they are great for attracting pollinators. things like bees and the little tiny wasps, native bees, even butterflies and things like that. It's interesting. Um, one time I went into a garden that was meant to be like a butterfly garden and pollinator attractor garden. And it was a whole bunch of native plants. But the problem was none of them were blooming at the time that I went in there. So there was hardly nothing in there. But when I went to the herb garden, I saw all kinds of bees and butterflies. And so lots of those are annual plants or long blooming perennials, and they just will bloom all summer long. Like basil, um, you can see there little tiny flowers, not very big, not super bright, but attracts lots of bees and lots of pollinators. And same is true of like oregano, sage, thyme, all the mints. They're all really good for attracting um, bees and good pollinators to your garden. So that's a really good thing. Now, the contrast is, or the difficulty is, lots of times you'll read about if you're trying to grow lots of leaves, you should be pinching them off. When you see like a flower happen, until you clip that off, so it'll grow more leaves and not grow flowers and grow the seed. But let's say you already feel like you've got your basil plants and they're pretty big already. You may not need more leaves. You can let them go flower and then they'll help attract the bees. So you can decide whether or not you want to pick the flowers off or not and get more leaves or leave the flowers and let them go. Now, when the plants are little, if they're little tiny, I recommend pulling the flowers off so that they'll grow more stems and more leaves and get bigger. Then you can harvest more leaves and then eventually let them flower later. Um, so anyhow, they are just really great for attracting lots of beneficial pollinating insects. Um, all right, let's talk about planting herbs. Obviously, you can plant seeds or you can put plants out. You know, if you go to a nursery and you go to the herb section, it can be really overwhelming. There might be like 30 different kinds of mint. There might be 20 different kinds of basil, 15 different kinds of thyme, 8 different kinds of oregano. And, you think like all these different things. Like you see like chocolate mint, you see holy basil, you see cardinal basil, all these different ones. And so those are great and they're fun, but really just the plain basic varieties of basil, the plain old oregano, plain old sage, are the main ones that typically you want to use for cooking. I'm not saying that there aren't some that'll be interesting, and I would start with the basic ones if you're going to go buy plants. And so that's the ones that we are growing here at Community Gardens. We don't have 100 different kinds of herbs. We have the basic culinary herbs that we think will be really useful to people in their garden. The other mistake sometimes is people buy too many plants. Like you buy 6 sage plants, that's going to be way too much sage. Nobody needs that much sage. You can start out with 1 or 2 plants of these different kinds of herbs, and typically that'll be enough. Unless, for instance, like for basil, and you want to make a lot of pesto sauce. Yeah, you might have a bunch of different basil plants, and you can start your own from seeds. Obviously, starting from seeds is cheaper. Lots of times the herb seeds are really tiny, like oregano seeds are extremely tiny, and they're almost like dust. So in that case, and they take a long time to grow. So you'd be better off just buying a couple plants. And that's what I tell people typically, because not only does it get you by the problem of really tiny seeds, but it gets you a big head start. And basil seeds are pretty easy to do. You just sprinkle them out, and when it's warm, they'll start to grow. But I kind of like to get my basil a little bit earlier than that, just like, tomatoes. You plant tomato plants because you want to get early tomatoes. You want to get early basil, put some plants out, and then maybe plant some more for seeds, from seeds you have later. But a lot of the herbs are kind of tiny seeds, and then you get way more seeds. You get like 1,000 seeds, and you only want 2 plants. So you might be better off buying a couple plants, especially if it's perennial plants, because they'll come up again next year. Sun or shade. Typically, you want to have full sun. Most herbs will do the most production of leaves in full sun. But the good news is, if you don't have full sun, you can still grow herbs. Lots of times with things like tomatoes and peppers and squash, we tell you if you're not going to have full sun, you're not going to get as many tomatoes, you're not going to get as many peppers. Um, but with the herbs, you'll still get lots of production in total full shade, like under a big tree. You won't get as much growth, and they won't be as strong as plants. So at least half day sun. If you get half day sun, you should be pretty well off with um, your herb garden. And then just like any other garden, basic good soil doesn't have to be anything special. If you want to do raised beds, a lot of people will grow herbs in containers, and that works really well. In fact, some things we recommend strongly growing them in containers, like mint, because it'll just take over your whole garden. Um, or some people build raised beds, and they'll have maybe one bed dedicated to their herbs because it's perennial. So you don't want to plant your perennial herbs in the place where you're going to want to till up, because once you plant them, you want to let them be for a while. To find a spot where they can be by themselves, and you won't have to dig that spot every year. So, and of course, good drainage is important. Some of the herbs are really fussy, things like lavender and sage. If it gets too wet over the winter, they may not survive because their roots just don't like to be too wet over the winter. And then again, just like we take care of our vegetables, there's certain things you're going to be doing. We recommend mulching, just because that stops the soil from baking and drying out. It keeps the ground soft. Plants are able to grow in the moister soil. The soil also stays cooler in the hot summer. If you put mulch down, you'll need to water less often. But obviously, herbs will need regular watering. The average garden needs about an inch of water a week. Um, Fertilizing, they say not so much with herbs. People tend to over fertilize herbs. They don't have as high fertilizer requirements as some of the vegetables, as some of the flowering annuals. Um, Obviously, if your soil is not very rich, but if you've added even just a little bit of compost, you'll probably be fine. And then if you want to, you can, mix up a little liquid fertilizer and fertilize different plants as you think they might need it. It's kind of interesting. There's not as many bug problems on herbs because lots of times the scent kind of deters certain insects from chomping on them a lot, but it'll happen sometimes. And there's also certain host plants, like for instance, the black swallowtail butterfly lays its eggs on members of the carrot family. So things like dill and fennel and cilantro are the host plants. So you'll see those caterpillars chomping on them sometimes. Sometimes people will pick off the caterpillars. Other times people will let them go because they want to see the butterflies and encourage the butterflies. And then there is a certain amount of pruning and pinching. So when you pinch on a stem, like on a basil, like right there, if you were to pinch that off right there, there'll be two buds that'll come out. So then two branches will come out, so they'll get bushier and make more leaves. So like when you're cutting some of the herbs to use them, you cut them like right above a joint, and then your plants will get bushier and they'll go out and get lots of branches, which is good. So it's not like you have to think too much about pruning because you're going to be cutting leaves. And typically what happens to most people is they have way more herb leaves than they're going to use. And they're just going to use a few, unless you're trying to dry some and keep them, for the winter, or maybe you're going to give some away as gifts, things like that. There is a certain amount of pinching and pruning. And really, all pinching means is you're just kind of pinching it rather than clipping it. But some people find it easier to use little clippers. What I like to use are what they're called floral snips. It's kind of a lightweight pruning shears. It's really good for trimming your herbs. As far as harvesting herbs, they're pretty easy. There's no magic involved here. People will just cut stems, and you can see different kinds of herbs. They literally just cut the stem, and then you tie them up with string or put a rubber band around it and then tie that up with string and hang them upside down and let them dry. So you want to do this someplace indoors typically, because if you do it outdoors, it could rain, and also, bugs could get at them or whatever. Indoors, it, works to dry out very nicely. Just have a little rack somewhere and hang like that. And these are kind of close to each other. Usually I like to give them a little bit of space so they're not actually touching each other. And the other thing is, you want to have fairly clean leaves to begin with, because at this point you're not going to wash them off. Um, if you do have a little bit of dirt on your leaves, you'd want to wash them right now, before they start to dry. Because once they start drying, you don't want to be getting them wet. But you could wash them at this point. If you're concerned about there might be little insects in there, or if there's a little bit of dirt. One thing you can do is to put mulch around your plants so that when it rains, it won't splash dirt up onto the leaves of the plants. So that's another good reason for mulch. But they're going to be attached to the stem, the leaves. You don't try to pull them off yet. Later on, when they're really dry, some people like to remove the stems, because that's really not where the fragrance is, or the flavor. It's basically usually in the leaves. So storing fresh herbs for short term, let's say you have some basil and you want to use it, you can actually literally cut it, and like how you put flowers in a vase, you can put the stems in a vase of water and they'll keep for a few days, just like that. If you know you're not going to use it right away, but you wanted to harvest some, you can do that. If you want to do long-term storage of fresh herbs, there's kind of a little trick you'll read about. And like for basil, generally most leaves don't freeze real well. Like if you cut a bunch of basil plants and just put them in the freezer, you would probably turn black and be kind of a disaster. But what you can do is fill up an ice cube tray with water and then cut some leaves off of basil or oregano or sage or whatever. So if you want some fresh green leaves, then put it in the ice cube tray. And so the little bunch of leaves is surrounded by water, and then they're going to freeze like that. And so, yeah, they're not going to be quite the same as like cutting fresh, but when you take them out, they're going to be pretty fresh and pretty green. And you can toss them into a recipe, like if you're going to make fresh pesto sauce or something like that. You just want to have some fresh oregano to add to your spaghetti sauce. So it works really well, freezing them in ice cubes like that. You'll read about sometimes people will like put them in bottles of oil, like they'll take olive oil and they'll put the leaves in there. And that's great, but then you've also got really oily herbs to deal with. And it's also relatively expensive and kind of messy. So I kind of like the ice cube tray if you're trying to do some fresh herbs and store them. But obviously drying herbs, for long-term preservation works really well too. And the thing is, once they're dried, then they can be powdered, and the flavor is actually concentrated. And some people really prefer the flavor of fresh herbs. Some people like the flavor of dried herbs. I like both. It kind of depends on what I'm doing. I like to use fresh when I can, like chopping up fresh rosemary or fresh basil into something is amazing. But they can also be great dried. So I never feel bad about using dried herbs. The old way of using the dried herbs would be, once they're like powder dry, is then you take the leaves and you could chop them up. And I don't know if you've ever seen like a mortar and pestle. So it's like a little bowl that's ceramic and it has this little thing like this, and you literally just put it in there and just grind them up. That's how people did it for thousands of years, and that works. But now you can actually buy kind of nifty little herb grinders. They're electric like that. It's basically kind of like a coffee grinder. And you take your really dried herbs and put them in there, and you can turn it on just like coffee. You can get fine or you can get coarse ground. So it works really good. Comes with a little brush, so you can clean up the machine when you're done. You can get things on like that at at specialty stores. You can also just order them online and works really, really well. Okay, now we are ready to talk about specific herbs. So these are, again, kind of the main culinary herbs, the ones that we use the most at community gardens that we grow, either plants or we have seeds available. I forgot to mention, so if you get a chance, you should come visit our herb garden in the summer. We have out here a children's garden called the Beanstalk Children's Garden. And in the summer, we have summer day camp groups come and visit and do field trips, just like kids go to the zoo and the nature center. And then in the fall, we have school groups come. And so it's great, but also families can just come on their own, or even if you're just by yourself, you don't have to bring kids with you. You can just come and look around and see the herb garden. But when kids come, one of the things we do is we teach them how to smell herbs. And so, for instance, like these basil leaves, if you just break off a basil leaf, yeah, it'll smell. And some of the herbs won't smell so much when you just pick a leaf off. But then if you take, like 2 or 3 leaves, hold them in your fingers and you rub them together like that, what you're doing is you're releasing the aromatic oils that are naturally in that plant that give off the scent, and it kind of releases that. And so then you can smell it a whole lot better if you kind of rub them together like that. So if you want to do that like with your mint or your basil or rosemary or whatever, when you're showing herbs to like kids or just showing your friends what they smell like, it'll smell a lot stronger. And then your fingers will smell great too. Um, so basil, it's an annual, it's fairly easy to grow. Um, it's definitely a warm season plant. Some of the other herbs can take quite a bit of cold, but basil plants are even more tender than tomato plants. When we start getting colder temperatures in the fall, the first thing to go will be basil, just because it's so tender. So don't put plants out until May. After you plant your tomato plants, then it's generally safe to plant your basil plant. But if you're going to put seeds out, I'd wait till May because they're not going to do anything until the soil warms up and starts getting warm. Basil is famous for use in Italian cooking. So pretty much every spaghetti sauce you've ever had, every pizza you've ever had, lasagna, it all has some basil in it somewhere. And of course, pesto is basically basil and oil and pine nuts. And that's just the sauce. It's used on lots of different kinds of food, pasta and things like that. Basil works really well for that freezing the leaves and putting them in ice cubes like I was talking about. It does get some fungus diseases. And so if you ever buy some plants like from a greenhouse and you see little black spots on the leaves, it's really hard to grow in the greenhouse because it's so humid in there without getting fungus disease on it. So, you might be better off just trying to grow your own. Here at community gardens, there are some special varieties that are resistant to those fungus. So we have to order special seeds. It doesn't happen so much. So if the plant looks green and no spots on it, it'll probably be fine once you get outside. Although some years we have more rain, you might see little spots. If you ever see spots on your basil leaf, just pull them off and that will stop the fungus from spreading. So if you want to get more green leaf, more bushy branches, remember you pinch those flowers off. But if you want to leave, once your plants get big, you want to leave the flowers on for the bees to attract more pollinators and move them on. You'll see lots of different varieties of basil. There's holy basil, there's Thai basil, there's cardinal basil. There's one that grows up just kind of column shaped. There's a dwarf basil. There's Italian large leaf basil. So the one that we have is just plain old basil, but it is that fungus resistant variety that we have. So we like that a lot, but it's your basic culinary basil. Chives, we're kind of going alphabetical here. And so the first name you see up there, chives, that's the common name. The other thing that looks like something you can't even pronounce, that's the Latin name. And that's helpful sometimes to make sure you're actually getting the right plant you want, especially because like there's different kinds of oregano. There's different plants that are called oregano. But basically any plant that's in the onion family is an allium. So this one is Allium Gymnospermum. That's the closest I can get. It's a hardy perennial. It looks, the leaves kind of look almost like grass, but if you'll rub them, you'll smell the onion flavor to it. At a certain point, they will have some purple flowers up like that. The flower stems are kind of hard and they're not very good for using with chive. Um, but the leaves are what you use, and they're pretty much using like a green onion, just like you'd buy a bunch of green onions. Chives are finer, a little more delicate, so you can cut them up, put them in scrambled eggs, put them in almost any kind of recipe where you use green onions. You can do them in stir fries. Um, so the mistake that people make is when they cut them off halfway. So they'll come and cut like that, and then you have this stalk that's not going to grow anymore. What you really want to do is just take part of the plant, like this little bit right here, cut it all the way to the ground, and then it'll grow up new branches from bottom. Then you'll next time do some on the other side, and you just do that a little bit, and that plant will always be renewing itself and always be growing. Um, if you get a lot of the purple flowers, I actually recommend cutting those and just removing them. I mean, once they're done blooming, if you like the looks of it. Because those stems on those are going to be hard, or you can just wait and when you cut them and just throw the flowers out because the stalks are harder and they don't work as well. There is another kind of chive called garlic chives, which is a close relative, and it's pretty similar, except for it has a little bit of garlic flavor. It's also perennial. But instead of purple flowers, it has white flowers. But the way you can tell the difference once they're big is the garlic chives has a flat leaf, and those are round leaves. If you cut them in sections, looks round. The other one you cut them in sections and they're flat. So both very useful herbs. The other thing I like about them is that it's one of the first things that's going to be sprouting up in the spring. When you don't have any onions, you can go out and cut some chives and use them and get some onions for your cooking. Chamomile is an annual. It is, and this is common chamomile. There's another one called Roman chamomile, which is a perennial. Roman chamomile has kind of a bitter taste to it, not quite as useful. This is an annual that's very ornamental. It has really nice, soft, feathery looking foliage. And then these small white daisy flowers. After it grows up, it'll start to go to seed, and you can kind of let it go to seed, and then you can literally cut it back, and those seeds will have dropped, and it'll sprout up again. So that's usually like kind of midsummer, like July. The plants are looking kind of bad, the flowers are fading, and you can cut it back, and it'll sprout up again and grow some more leaves for fall. So it's really, and it'll reseed itself. So once you plant, like out in our children's garden, we never have to plant these seeds again. Even though it's not a perennial, it will reseed itself and come back year after year and work really well. Very famous for making tea. Supposed to be really calming and relaxing. Sometimes for people who have trouble sleeping, they say eat some chamomile tea. Generally most teas are kind of relaxing, but this is supposed to be especially good for that. And then there's dill. And of course, dill flavoring in dill pickle. Lots of times people will cut the leaves from dill and use that like in potato salad as a garnish, but actually has a really nice flavor. I love the taste of dill in like mayonnaise, salad dressing, different things like that. So it has that nice feathery looking foliage, very lacy. And then at some point it has flowers that are kind of shaped in a flat, what they call an umbel. That's what that shape is. And then it doesn't grow as much leaves. So sometimes what people recommend is plant some dill early, and then maybe a month later plant another batch of dill, and then maybe another month later plant another batch of dill. That way you'll always have some of the nice green leaves going along. So it is very ornamental. Some people will actually use those flowers in like bouquets mixed in with other flowers. So kind of a multi-purpose plant. And then there's lavender. Lavender is a perennial. The tricky part is some of the varieties are hardy and some are not. If you see something called Spanish lavender, it's not very hardy and probably won't make it over the winter, but has bigger flowers. Um, and of course, it would be great if it looked like that all summer long, but it doesn't. It has a period where it blooms for maybe a month or so like that, and then those flowers will fade and you want to cut them off so it's not putting all its energy into producing seed. And then it might have a few flowers here and there. But even just the foliage is really aromatic. And but people will dry the flowers and use them. They'll make like sachets, with the leaves and the flowers together, tie it up in a bundle, and people will use it to like, fragrance for their bed linens or something like that, or just to make their room smell nice. Lavender is used a lot in perfumes, in body care products, even toothpaste now. But they're also using lavender in baked goods. Like if you go to a fancy bakery, they might have lavender scones or something like that. Or you'll see recipes for lavender cookies or cake and things like that. And it does kind of add a real interesting flavor. It's hard to describe what it's like, um, but it is an interesting flavor. The one thing about lavender is it needs good drainage. If you have heavy clay soil, not going to do so well. They kind of like sandier soil, looser soil, lots of organic matter. So it works well in a raised bed. Um, there is a new variety of lavender that is recently been developed, and it's not like it's chemically, or it's not like a GMO variety that they did something weird to it. They found a lavender that can tolerate less than perfect drainage. And I'm trying to remember, it's got a name like Sensational or something like that. And we actually have some going out in the children's garden. So if you really want to know the name of it, send me an email or send it to our contact and get you the exact name of it. But there's one of them that's sensational, another one that's like fantastic or something like that. You can really imagine the name. But it's a little more tolerant to, less than perfect drainage, and heat. That's the other thing. Hot, humid summers can be a problem for lavender. But in the winter, if your spot stays wet, especially if it's heavy clay soil, your lavender may not make it over the winter. You might have to replant it again next year. So the plants can be expensive. So you want to pick a variety that's rated hardy for our zone 5 or so, and it might be good to try one of those special varieties. Sometimes in the spring, some of the top leaves stems may look dead, and that's true of a lot of herbs like sage, lavender. I don't know, even the mints and things like that. There'll be dead stalks next spring, and you trim those off, and you'll get nice new growth coming up from the bottom, and they'll be all fresh looking. If you look at pictures of lavender online, you'll see like pictures of lavender farms, and they look so good. All this really beautiful rows of lavender, and that's great. We just don't have perfect growing conditions, but places like the Mediterranean, Greece, Spain, southern France, that's where you see lavender farms lots of times. There are some lavender farms in Missouri and Kansas that are actually doing pretty well, but they make nice raised beds and give them really good drainage. Mint. Okay, so mint is a hardy perennial. There's different flavors, and there's even in those flavors, there's many different varieties. But like peppermint and spearmint are kind of the main couple of mints that you might see, but then you'll see things like apple mint or orange mint or chocolate mint. And does chocolate mint really have a chocolate flavor to it? I don't know. That's up for you to decide. I would like to see them blind taste test somebody and tell them, can you pick out the chocolate mint or not? I don't know. I think almost any mint tastes good with chocolate, but anyhow, the foliage is very refreshing, very fragrant. It grows like a weed, literally. Very aggressive plant growth. if you plant it in your raised bed and you're gone for 2 or 3 weeks, it'll take over your whole raised bed. I do not recommend planting it in your regular garden. I don't recommend planting in a raised bed. Works really great in containers, which is why I picked this picture. This looks kind of goofy. It looks like they're growing in plastic tubs or coolers or something like that. And that's because they did not want to put them in the ground and have them take over, which is what they do. In our children's garden, what we do is we put them in pots, but then we put the pot in the ground, but because it's a plastic pot, it's got only tiny holes way at the bottom, and they spread by the shoots up above. And so they don't take over. They stay right in a little pot. And so you can do that if you want to do that. Or you can just have the pot be on your patio or whatever. You need to make sure you water it. But we actually tell people you're not allowed to plant it. Like if you rent a raised bed or a garden plot at a community garden, you're not allowed to put mint in because it will take over. Just too many people make that mistake. Again, there's many different varieties, all those different flavors. Some of them are pretty creative, like mojito, or whatever. And some of them are mintier than others. So some of those are definitely worth trying, and they have really good flavor. But mints are used in lots of things. They're used like toothpaste, all kinds of lotions, shampoos, and of course, mint tea is very, very popular. Oregano is a hardy perennial. It's almost kind of like a ground cover if you keep it trimmed. Many varieties. The Greek oregano, from all that I've read, appears to be the one that's the most used the most as far as in cooking. Sometimes you'll see something even on a package, and it'll say like Mexican oregano. That's a totally different plant, not even related. But it has a smell kind of like oregano. So some people use it like oregano. So I'm not going to tell you not to use it. I'm just saying just make sure you know what you're getting. The Greek one is the one that's considered traditional for cooking. And of course, it's kind of interesting. That's what's, oregano is famous for Italian cooking, but it's Greek oregano. But, they're pretty close to each other. So that's why it ended up there. But, it's used a lot in French cooking, also the Mediterranean cooking. But spaghetti sauce, pretty much going to have oregano. That does have small pink flowers that are very attractive to bees and other pollinators. You can use it fresh, you can use it dried. And again, so there's other plants that are called oregano. Just if you're wanting to get real traditional oregano, I would get one they call Greek oregano. That's the one that we would be selling here at Community Garden. It's pretty easy to grow. It spreads, but it's not like mint that you can't keep it under control. Parsley is like the one that's biennial. And there's kind of two main different kinds of parsley. One is the curly leaf parsley, and then there's the flat leaf parsley. Just so you'll know, people who are real chefs who like to do a lot of cooking, the flat leaf parsley is the one that's preferred for cooking. It has the most flavor. One on the top was developed more for the foliage. It still has parsley flavor, not considered quite as much a gourmet herb. Used to be parsley was what like if you go to a restaurant, they'd put a little piece of parsley on the side of the plate to make it look nice, And now lots of times they use kale as your little garnish, but sometimes they still use parsley. But for cooking, I do recommend the Italian flat leaf parsley at the bottom. I see a mistake on here where it says ornamental with gray green foliage. That was copied over from another slide. So that one I'm going to have to fix. Because they don't have gray green foliage, and they don't have little blue flower spikes. What happens with parsley is the second year, it'll actually produce flowers that look kind of like dill. And there'll be those yellow flat flowers, and you'll see that in the second year. And it is an important host for that black swallowtail butterfly. And usually it's kind of interesting. Some caterpillars will just eat up a whole plant. Usually you'll just see one or two, and you can let it go if you want. But if your parsley plant isn't very big, you might want to pull it off. And you could try putting it on another plant, like if you have some dill or some carrots or wild Queen Anne's lace or something like that, or fennel. If you grow fennel, it's very vigorous. Um, the other thing about parsley is really, really great ingredient for a sauce called chimichurri sauce. And if you haven't had that, you should try it. One of our staff people here makes that for us and uses it a lot in cooking, different kind of like grilled meats and things like that. Look it up, try it. It's really, really great. It uses parsley and oil and some other things that really great thing. Kind of like a pesto sauce almost, just a little bit different. And then there's rosemary, which is a perennial, but it's not hardy here in the winter. Every now and then we have a mild enough winter that it might make it, over the winter, especially if you protect it, maybe put some leaves up around it. You can do that. Again, it's actually a shrub. I went out to one year, I got to go to Monterey, California, and, they had rosemary plants, like big bushes, just like we have big evergreens. Everyone had rosemary plant, this big in front of their house. So they never run out of rosemary. But here, you buy a plant and let it grow. And, in the fall, it might be, like this tall, and then you can cut a bunch and dry it or whatever. Some people, I say, will try to cover it over, maybe put some row cover over it. Some varieties are hardier than others. Some people will grow it in a pot, and then you can bring that pot in for the winter. And it may not make it through the whole winter because it might be too warm in your house. But you could still pick little leaves of rosemary almost all winter long. So it really is a great herb. It's funny. It's one of the things that when you smell rosemary by itself, it doesn't always smell like something you would want to eat. But when it's cooked with stuff, the flavor is enhanced, and when it's chopped up finer. So it's just kind of interesting how sometimes it's different when you actually cook with it rather than just taste. If you just taste the leaf by itself, it tastes kind of strange. And then there's sage. And just so you know, sage is a member of the salvia group of plants. You'll see lots of ornamental sages. There's some that have red flowers, some that have blue flowers, and they're grown like annual flower plants. They're not grown for the herb leaf, but the garden sage, or sometimes called common sage or culinary sage, is Salvia officinalis. That's the one you want to get for growing as an herb. Has this nice gray-green foliage. Of course, lots of sages have that. Usually used dried, but lately I've been seeing more and more recipes that use it fresh. The other thing that's interesting, if you've ever had breakfast sausage, like most people have, that's what gives breakfast sausage its unique flavor as breakfast sausage. Now, lots of sausages will include a little bit of sage, but sage is kind of heavy in breakfast sausage, whether it's links or patties or whatever, or loose, and that gives it its distinctive flavor. So if I remember actually experimenting once with just buying some ground pork and ground hamburger and mixing it together and putting ground sage in it. And basically, you can make your own breakfast sausage. So that's why they say don't use too much sage because it will overwhelm a recipe and make stuff taste like breakfast sausage, which is fine if that's the effect we're going for. But lots of times we'll mix it with other herbs and it'll be a nice blend of herbs. Sometimes the leaves will, the stalks will die back in the spring. Sometimes if it's a wet spring, again, this one's another one likes nice drainage, what does well on a raised bed. And sometimes it'll just die over the winter. Usually that's because the soil is too heavy, too much clay, and it stayed too wet over the winter. It likes good drainage. You can also see what the flowers look like. During it's usually like late May, early June, these nice flower spikes, and they're really beautiful. They don't last all season. They last for a few weeks, just like a perennial flower, and they're gorgeous. And of course, they attract lots of bees. Just about to wrap up here. I got a couple more. Summer savory. Summer savory is an herb that really wasn't on my radar for many years. I just didn't see it used in a lot of recipes. not in a lot of things. Um, but we had someone on our staff who was a chef, and she said that it was like one of her favorite herbs. And she said just most people don't use it, they don't appreciate it. Lots of times when you read about it, it says it's really good for cooking with beans, and yeah, it would be, but it's used as so much more. Um, Usually used dry, but you can also use it fresh. You can see what the leaves look like. It has little tiny flowers, almost looks like a rosemary or a lavender or something at that point, with the leaves. It's easy to grow from seed, just sprinkle seeds out and they'll grow, or you can buy plants. We'll have some plants available here. It's interesting, it's very popular in Eastern European cuisine, Bulgaria and Romania. In fact, the article I was reading about said in Bulgaria, you have three things on your table at every meal. You have salt, you have pepper, and you have dried summer savory. That's how much they use it. And I thought that was interesting. It's also one of the herbs. I don't know if you've ever heard of this herb blend called Herbe de Provence. It's from the south of France. Typically has like oregano, thyme, rosemary, parsley, I think, and summer savory is one of like those five herbs in this very famous French Mediterranean herb blend that you can buy at the store, or you can grow it yourself. So it really is, easy to do, and it has a really sort of distinctive flavor. And then I think our last one, thyme. And again, you'll see different times when you go to the herb greenhouses. Um, it is a hardy perennial. There's something called mother of thyme, which is grown like a ground cover. There's some different flavors. There's a lemon thyme, which is kind of cool, has a nice lemon flavor to it. But the basic one is this Thymus vulgaris, just a common, used to be called German thyme. So you'll see that sometimes, or winter thyme. It's a tiny low-growing plant, almost like a ground cover. Got wiry stems, tiny little leaves, can be used fresh or dried. It's also the source of this essential oil called thymol. And you Google that, it'll tell you all kinds of amazing things, can be used for disinfectant. And it's got actual scientific research that's being used for things. Sometimes the little stems will have little parts that die out, and you'll need to trim it back so it gets bushy again in the spring. Again, there's many different types you'll see at the nurseries and greenhouses, but this is the main one, just plain old thyme. Again, it's also one of the herbes de Provence that I was talking about, so it does have really good flavor. A little bit about herbs. If you go to some, of course, you can buy herbs at community gardens. We're trying to grow more and more each year so we don't run out. So this year we doubled the amount of herbs that we're growing. But if you do want to try buying some herbs, you'll go to like different greenhouses like Heartland Greenhouse or Overland Park Greenhouse or Soil Service Garden Center. You'll see a brand there sometimes called Pantry Garden Herbs. And I normally don't do commercials for people, but they are really good growers. It's Sullivan's Greenhouse, which is way out south here, about 30 miles away, and they supply herb plants to to all the different garden centers, Overland Park, Heartland, Soil Service, Suburban Lawn and Garden, and you'll see that Pantry Garden label there. You can be sure that is a good one because they're grown very healthy, but they're also grown organically. And maybe with your flowers, it doesn't matter as much to grow them organically. But herbs are something you're going to eat. So to get certified organically grown herb with no chemical pesticides in it is a good thing. I mean, that's what we do here in our garden, in our greenhouse too. But they have many, many more varieties. You'll get the 15 different kinds of basil, 20 different kinds of mints, all the different things. You want to try some of the exotic stuff. They're also really nice people. They actually donate plants to us, and we use some of them in our herb garden and flowers and things like that. So Sullivan's Greenhouse, Pantry Garden Herbs. That's our presentation. Starting in, we have our cool season plant sale at the end of March. I think it's like March 24th, 23rd, 24th, something like that. It's on our website. That's when we'll first be selling some herbs, but we should have enough to last through our plant season when we have tomatoes, sell tomatoes and peppers. So if you haven't had some herbs, that's the time to get them at one of those plant sales or in between. You don't have to wait just for the plant sale. If you haven't been here before, come and visit us when we're open during normal daylight hours, and you find out you can get a membership at Kansas City Community Gardens. Look at our website. We have an incredible website that tells all about us, tells about all the different programs we do. We do schoolyard gardens, we do community gardens, we do community orchards, and of course we have the children's garden. And then again, individual families can join, and we have really low prices for low income households, so they don't have to spend very much money for their seeds and plants. But even if you're not low income, you can join, become members, and that helps support the community gardens. And we try to have really good varieties that we know will do good here in Kansas City, and really good varieties of plants as well. So we got newsletters out there. If you want to grab a newsletter on your way out, it's also available online. But if anybody has questions, we can take some questions. Otherwise, we're going to be having more workshops coming up. Look on the website, and it'll tell you the different workshops that are coming up. Questions? I do. And for even potted vegetables or potted flowers, because that's the problem growing in containers is they dry out so quickly. You know, when it's 100 degrees outside, you literally will need, or even 90 degrees outside, you'll need to water your container, most of them, once a day. If it's a large container, yeah, it might go 2 days. But if you put just a little bit layer of mulch on top, that will stop it from drying out so quickly because it won't evaporate. So yeah, and it keeps the soil cooling. So I recommend mulch whenever you can. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. So growing herbs indoors can be a challenge, especially for starting from seed. It's difficult. What I recommend to people is maybe buying small plants and then putting in slightly larger pots. Or if you buy some plants and you grow them on your patio over the summer, they can be outdoors, they get nice and big, especially like rosemary, and then bring that indoors. And again, as you get further through the winter, they may not make it all winter long because it's not perfect indoors. But if you try to start something from seed with a small plant, it's hard because it's hard to get enough light. You can try adding some transplant, yeah. Yeah, so you can do that. And I would say basil is a good one. Things like parsley would be a good one. Oregano, sage, rosemary, any of them work. But give them the best light you can give them. And again, take that transplant and it's in a little tiny pot, put it in a slightly bigger pot, good potting soil, give it a little bit of fertilizer now and then, and you can have some herbs going through the season. It is nice to go out in December or in February and pick a little fresh herbs just to add a little bit. Chives are another one that's fairly easy to do, especially if you grew a plant in a pot on your patio. You can bring that in. More questions? All right, well, I'll be up here for a little bit if you do have a question. Again, thank you for coming tonight. And come visit us at Community Gardens.